I, Sarah Shatman, Sarah, Sadie Goldstein, and Sid Winston are writing these memoirs in 1993 at the age of 92. This century is one of the most interesting ones. We came from horses to automobiles to airplanes, from horse manure in the streets with white-dressed street cleaners pushing carts and using brooms and shovels to pick up the manure left by the horses. Now, instead of horse manure, we have air pollution, we have noise from all the electrical equipment, and noise from automobiles and airplanes. Taking them and was born my father was born in Nizhny Novgorod in Russia, but I'd always thought it was a very small town. And so most of the Jewish boys felt they had to get out of Russia and Russian Poland before they were kidnapped or gone into the Russian army. My father must have come over at that time because he was 17 when he got here to America. Judging by the fact that he died at the age of 87 in 1935, and by doing some arithmetic, we feel that he came over either in 1859 or 1860, sometime around that time while the Civil War was going on in America. When immigrants came over to America, they generally lodged with relatives or landsleit, people from their own community. At any rate, the next I heard about my father, he was in the manufacturing business, and his nephew, Mendel, was the overseer for the plant. My father also must have been an itinerant salesman, because from one of those trips he came back to find that his business had been burnt down. He never went back into that business, because the next I heard of him making a living, he was in real estate. Also at that time, when people said to him, "Goldstein, why don't you get married?" he would say, "The girl for me hasn't been born yet." And in truth, my mother hadn't been born at that time. My father's family name was Zloty Kamyen. Zloty means gold or money. Kamyen means mountain or stone. So Zloty Kamyen is gold stone. He had 12 brothers and sisters. 3 of them came to America. Uncle Louis settled in Cincinnati. Uncle Joe settled in Hartford, and my father settled in New York. He went into this business and later into the real estate business. My mother worked in my father's shop at that time, and therefore she married the boss. My mother was born in Großstattin in Germany. Her parents were evidently quite wealthy, but her mother ran the business, which was very usual. Her father was a yeshiva bocher, which means a student in a yeshiva, or a Hebrew school. My parents, her parents were rather wealthy because she said they had a cook in the kitchen, and she was never allowed into the kitchen. They also had other help. In those days, when a rich man had a marriageable daughter, he looked around to find a student, a Hebrew student, because this was a yichus, or an honor. Therefore, when my grandmother married my grandfather, she was the businesswoman and he was the student. They came to America at some time when things probably went wrong for them over in Europe. And they must have come over first class because they brought with them 2 Torahs, the kind that you use in the synagogue, reading from the Torahs for the Sabbath and the holidays. My grandmother has a photograph in a red plush album, which Arthur rescued from my 64th Street house when I gave up the house after Perry died. She's rather a buxom lady. She has a hat with aigrettes in it, and her bosom is covered with jewelry. My grandfather's photograph is also there. He looked like a very quiet, subdued gentleman with a little beard. My father's mother also has her photograph in that album, and her face is rather wizened and wrinkled, but she's very well dressed. And all of these photographs were taken by a professional photographer. So there must have been money somewhere in the family at that time. Sometime after my father they were married, they bought the house at 341 East Houston Street. I think all of the children were born in that house. My mother had 8 pregnancies, but only 4 of us survived, 4 girls. In fact, when I was born, and my father said, a girl, another rat was born. Flora was the oldest. She's 12 years older than I. Mamie came next, and she was about a year and a half younger than Flora. And then came Dolly, who was about 2 years younger than Mamie, and then I was the last. When they bought the house, it must have been a very nice neighborhood. It was very well situated. It was on Houston Street between Ridge Street and Pitt Street. A half a block away on Pitt Street, there was a lovely park. I think it was the Hamilton Fish Park. Hamilton Fish was one of our legislators. Across the street from the park, on the left, there was a lovely public library, which I used extensively. And on Sheriff Street, the next block, was the school, PS 22, which I attended for 6 years. The house consisted of 4 stories and a floor on the street level. The store ran around the corner under the next apartment house as well, and was occupied by Marcus Brothers, who sold dry goods. It was evidently a very fine shop because people came from all over to buy their clothes there. When that house above the store was owned by the John Jacob Astor estate, and therefore my father was known as the John Jacob Astor of the East Side. Our apartment house was really a tenement house. It consisted of 4 floors. Each floor had 8 rooms. which were divided into 4 two-room apartments, a kitchen, dining room, and a bedroom. Our apartment consisted of 8 rooms since we were the landlord of the house, and we had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, dining room, and we had a parlor. My mother and father occupied 1 bedroom. Flora and Mamie occupied the other bedroom, and Dolly and I slept on a roll-away bed in the kitchen. The parlor, which was saved only for company, was really dressed up beautifully. It had a player piano in it. It had overstuffed green plush furniture with dark mahogany wood. It had a rug, and it had a mantelpiece with a mirror above it, and on the shelf below there were some gadgets that my mother brought in, and a tidy. The tidy was green silk with pressed flowers, colored flowers, and a long fringe. And nobody was allowed into that parlor unless we had company or played the piano. I can remember pumping my legs on the piano and playing Poet and Peasant. I know we had 2 toilets on each floor. I don't think there were flush toilets at that time, and each 2 tenants had permission to use one of the toilets. Later on, we did have toilets in the apartments, and we also had hot water and bathtubs, but much, much later. At that time, I think we may have had gas lights in the hall, and each one of the sisters, in turn, had the privilege of lighting the gas in the halls at about sundown or twilight and turning them off at 10 o'clock, for which we got an allowance of 10 cents a week. The house was heated by coal and wood stove, and cooking was done on that stove. The coal was brought in by a coal man who sold coal, and I think the wood must have been brought in. I know the fire was lit by newspapers to get it going. I can remember, and many years later, boiling diapers on that stove for Mamie's daughter, Lorraine, after Mamie died. I don't remember when the bathtubs were put in, because when I was young, we were bathed in a divided clothes washing tubs, tubs, separated by a sort of a fence, and that was removed for us to take a bath. We also washed dishes in that wash tub. We also washed clothes in that wash tub. We also had what we called a Polisher Shiksa. We always had a maid who came in one day a week who scrubbed the floors and cleaned the place for many, many years. And on Sabbath, we had a Shabbos Goy, a Christian who came in and lit the fires. We also used those 2 Torahs that I spoke about before in the ark, which my grandparents had brought over and my mother had inherited. We had a minyan there every Saturday morning. 10 men who came in from the neighborhood said their prayers there, and then my mother would serve a schnapps, a little glass of liquor, and some cookies or sponge cake or something like that, after which they would sit around and discuss the portion of the day. And here is I, little Sadie, sitting there and absorbing everything that they said. And I think I got a lot of my Hebrew education from listening to that discourse. In fact, I once asked a question. I said, if there were only two people in the earth, God had only created Cain and Abel, and Cain killed Abel, and then Cain went out among the peoples of the world, where were the peoples of the world? And they answered me in Yiddish, Geh die narrische Kind, frag nicht seine Schales. Go, you foolish child, don't ask such questions. My father was an American citizen, as was my mother. And since he owned the house, they would put liens on the house. Something was wrong with it. And my father would take it to the Democratic captain. At that time, the Democratic Party in New York City was known as Tammany Hall. And the leader of the party would take the lien, and he would say, go home, Goldstein, it's taken care of. But when my father came to vote, he would say, go home, Goldstein, you voted already. So he always paid back. House and street must have been an elegant neighborhood when they bought the house, but by the time I grew up, there were push carts on the street. These were two-wheeled push carts, and each merchant has his own spots. They sold lovely polished fruit. They sold knickknacks. They sold children's underwear and things of that kind. And later on, one of my best friends, Molly Hatfield, I remember that her father had had a push cart on that street almost in front of our house. Later on, the push carts disappeared. And the neighborhood became run down. And I wanted to move away from there in the worst way. All of my sisters were married from that house. Mamie was buried from that house. I was married from that house. But in between, while I was going to school and high school and college, I hated that neighborhood, and I called it the bane of my existence. And whenever any of my friends passed the house, they would say, I've got a regards for you. I passed your bane today. When we finally moved from the house, my parents donated the 2 Torahs to a synagogue, who took them and with music walked around the block and said a lot of prayers. When I was 6 years old, on November 22nd, my father tried to enroll me in an elementary school. Somehow the house was just far enough away from each school so that each school refused to take me. This must have been in December, and he took me to PS 13, from which Dolly had graduated. They said I was out of the district. He took me to PS 22 on Sheriff Street. They said I was out of the district. He took me to PS number 4 on Rivington Street. They said I was out of the district. Finally, in desperation, my father got permission from one of his real estate agents who lived right next to PS 22 on Sheriff Street. And my father enrolled me as living in that house where the agent lived. They couldn't refuse me because I lived right next door. I went to that school for 4 years, and then I transferred to PS4 in Rivington Street. But while I was in that school, I had to pass the lovely park and the library, going home for lunch and coming home from lunch. And invariably, I stopped at the library. And while I ate my lunch, I read the book. And when I went back to school, evidently, instead of paying attention, I read the book, because at 3 o'clock I stopped at the library again, and I wanted another book. The librarian said, you just took it out before. I said, I finished it. She said, tell me the story. And I would tell her the story, and I would get another book. I must tell you the story of the skates. My mother used to use a soap called satin gloss soap. This was a soap that you used, it was a laundry soap. And you had a coupon on the top of the soap, which you could redeem at one of the redemption centers. And so she kept those coupons in a tin coffee can that was emptied after using the coffee in it. And I wanted skates because everybody seemed to me it had skates. I don't know whether I was 10 or 11 at that time, but I stole some of those coupons. Also at that time, we didn't have refrigeration. We had ice boxes. These were just boxes that had sort of a zinc lining, and the iceman would come with a cube of ice in his ice tongs, remove the fruit and vegetables, and put the ice cube in the top of the ice box. Well, the ice had to melt somewhere, and it would melt down a pipe and empty into a basin under the ice box. Somebody had to empty the basin, and since I was the youngest, my turn came, and I had to empty the basin. And so, when I borrowed the coupons, I went to the redemption store, and I got a pair of skates. In those days, the skates had wooden wheels. I took the skates, and I learned how to skate, and where to keep the skates, because my mother and father didn't want me to skate. I might hurt myself. So since I emptied the basin from under the ice box, I used to hide the skates right next to that basin, and they never found out. So however, there was a river on the other side, about a block away, the Neversink River, and we used to go swimming in that river. One year, they rented the farm to the Jewish actors. My father would always rent it to somebody who had a following, because all he did was collect the money for the rent. We had nothing to do with the people who were at the farm, at the hotel. But this year, I started wandering over to the hotel. They would sit outside playing cards, and this little child with big ears and big eyes would stand and watch. My father and mother used to sit and play pinochle, two-handed pinochle, every night. If he won, he scratched the slate on the vertical side. If she won, they got a marker on the horizontal side. And so my sister Dolly, who was about 4 years older than I guess, wrote down the meld of pinochle. And she taught me what the meld was of the pinochle. And when I would learn the meld, she would teach me how to play, and we would play. And so I would wander over to the actors and watch them play cards all the time. And I learned how to play 21 and 66 and poker and all the other card games which I later played. These people, my mother would say to me, "You see that lady over there, the one that's all dressed up, and she's wearing jewelry, her hair is fixed to the nth degree, she's wearing a hat and she's wearing gloves. That lady is a nobody. She wants to be an actress, but she doesn't get a job. So she's trying to act the part. But you see that other lady there in the house dress with her hair up in curlers? That's Mrs. Tomaszewski. When you're a star or you're important, you never have to try to be or look important, because people will know you're important for your inner worth." And I can still see my mother telling me that and pointing the ladies out, and I never forgot it. And I really lived by that rule. Every year, we would get a dressmaker in the house, and she would sew dresses for Flora and Mamie. They were both eligible for marriage, a colomoid, we used to say. And she would make them the same dresses in different colors. I remember one costume. Flora had an orchid costume, and Mamie had a salmon pink one. And they had big bows in the back of their hair, and they really looked lovely. And my father would pack these two big steamer trunks with all the clothes, and the bedding, the pillows, the blankets, all the clothes that we needed that all of us needed. Of course, we were my father, my mother, and the 4 girls. And then he would put the bedding in the last minute. If we couldn't close the valises, he would get in and stamp everything down with his feet. I don't remember how we ever got those valises to the Disbrowser Street ferry, because as I said before, we had no automobiles. We just would have rented a cart, I suppose, drawn by horses, and taken to the Disbrowser Street ferry, where they were put on the ferry and I guess taken up the Hudson River and disembarked. And then somebody from our farm would meet us with the horses and the gig, another carriage, and take us and the valises to the farm. As I said before, my father was a very shrewd businessman. He had this farm. When we left it, he rented it during the summer, as I said, and so he made the money for the taxes. And then we had a neighbor across the street, Schneider, and he permitted Schneider to use our farm animals, horses, cows, and to cut the hay and use it for all the animals, and to use the produce that we had in a little garden, in exchange for which he took care of the farm for us, cut the grass and so on. And so the farm was really rent-free, cost us nothing. We had a lot of produce from the garden. I would go out and pick green peas. I would pick dig for potatoes, pick the corn when my mother wanted fresh corn for cooking. I would eat blackberries, strawberries, and raspberries right from the vines. The strawberries I would trample on the hay and pick them from the hay fields. My father didn't like that because the hay went to the animals. We also had chestnut trees, and they had burrs, but I remember pulling them down with long sticks and hitting them with stones. When they opened up, there was lovely sort of plush on the inside, and then the chestnuts themselves, and we'd either roast them or eat them raw. So that I had a lovely time there. I learned how to ride the horses. I learned how to milk a cow, which I did rarely, and had a wonderful summer. But my friends were all in the city, and I was dying to get home to the city and not go up there anymore. And I think that we stayed up there until I was about 14 or 15. We would leave the city in May. My father would take me out of school and then not bring me home until about October. But somehow or other I would always catch up with the work, and I never failed anything. At one point, some gypsies came by and saw one of our horses which they liked, and they offered to trade my father for the horse. My father didn't want to trade, and so the next morning when we woke up, the horse was gone, and one of their plugs, a very stupid horse, was left in its place. We never regained our own horse. This horse we named Katie. It would never want to leave the barn, but when we got it out of the barn on the road, it would go very slowly. But when we turned around to come back, it knew that it was going to be fed. It would gallop back. We had a shochet who slaughtered the chickens for us, and he had a wife, and we used to sing a song. I wouldn't live in East Glenwild, I'll tell you the reason why. 'Cause Gordon makes the kishka and Stifka makes the pie. At night, Sometimes we would visit some of the other hotels. Flora would play the piano. Mamie and I would sing. I was a corn chowder in those days, and we were very welcome visitors at any of the hotels.